Hello, today we're going to do our last day of notes, excuse me, for chapter 9 and chapter 10. We're just flying through these chapters, hitting the highlights and plugging along and moving forward. Um, this lesson is about the War of 1812. And just like everything else, it's kind of got a weird name because the war was not in 1812. It started in 1812, but it ended in 1814. So it makes it sound like it's a 1 year war. No, it was a 3 year war. And not that wars are usually very useful, but this was probably the most useless war in the history of, one of the most useless wars in the history of the United States. I'll explain. By this time, our new president was James Madison. And we talked about James Madison a little bit already, father of our Constitution. He was good friends with Thomas Jefferson, believed in a lot of the things that Jefferson believed in. And as always, France and England, they were just having fights. They can't stay out of each other's way. We talked about Napoleon and that kind of stuff going on, and they just don't like each other. They're fighting for the be the powerhouse in Europe, and the United States was trying to stay out of it. It's trying to stay neutral. If you're neutral, you're not going for either side. If your vehicle's in neutral, you're not going forward, you're not going backwards, you're just staying there. So France or the United States tried to stay neutral in this war between England and France. But it kept being more and more difficult because England was helping the Indians some, and France didn't have all the goods. So we started to trade with France a little bit. Well, as you could expect, this made England mad, and they decided to come after us. So it eventually led to war. So for 3 years, basically, 1812, 1813, 1814, the two sides fought some battles and nobody won. No one won. Nothing happened. Nothing changed. It ended in December of 1814. And when it ended, everything was exactly the way it was before it started, just with a lot more dead people. No land changed hands, no nothing. Everything, no money changed hands. Whatever England had before, England had after. Whatever France had before, France had after. Whatever America had before, America had after. It was completely useless war for time, effort, money, loss of life, and all that. Nothing worth happening. Except there were two major events that came about from this war. Two major events, a couple major events that happened during this war. The first, as you can see in this picture, in August of 1814, the British burnt down the White House. James Madison was not at home, but his wife, Dolly, who was a very famous first lady, she was at home. And the way the story goes is she was preparing for some kind of dinner that evening and had set up, places for people to eat and made all of this food and with some help, but they had all this food ready to go. And the British attacked the White House. So before the British burnt down the White House, which is what they eventually did, as you can tell by this drawing. Well, they evidently ate the meal she had prepared for her guests. So it was nice of them to eat her food before they burnt down her house. But while that was going on, she ran around and started collecting some important papers, including and artifacts, including a portrait of George Washington that is still hanging in the new White House today. And she was able to do all that and get out before the fire started, before the fire really got going. So she did save a lot of things. Um, she was big into Snapchat. You may have not known that, but Dolly Madison was big into it, and James didn't message a lot, but he did read it, and she sent him this message that says, "James, I may have burnt supper." That was her Snapchat message to him that night because their house was kind of on fire and burnt down to the ground, and eventually had to be totally rebuilt, um, basically from scratch. There's still some areas where you could tell where it had been before, but basically had to be rebuilt from scratch. Also, in the War of 1812, something happened, and it happened in September of 1814, and it happened at the Battle of Baltimore. At this battle, a guy by the name of Francis Scott Key wrote a poem, which would eventually become our national anthem. Um, I'll tell the story a little bit more in another day of notes, but he was on a ship and he was kind of being held captured on the ship, so he couldn't. He knew some information, about England that they didn't want getting out, so he couldn't move, and he watched them bombing this fort in Baltimore. Watched him Fort McHenry. Watched him bomb it all night, and when he got up in the next morning, he noticed that the American flag was still flying, which means that the Americans had not lost the battle. That we had won the battle because it was still flag was still there. And he started writing a poem, had 4 verses. Eventually, that poem was taken and put into a melody of an old Irish or an old drinking song. And now it is our national anthem. It's called the Star Spangled Banner. And again, we'll do a little bit more with that, not today, but we'll do some more with that here in the next couple of days. So the War of 1812, nothing changed hands, but the White House was burned down. Dolly Madison saved a lot of things, and Francis Scott Key, and if I sing it, it'd be Francis Scott Off Key, wrote the Star Spangled Banner, which is our national anthem, and that is the end of our chapter 10 notes.